At the end of the last TT episode, this car wasn't exactly in the best state. I found a problem I didn't feel comfortable driving the car with, so we parked it. Today we're going to sort that out, and in addition to that, we're going to do some much needed maintenance. But before we can do any of that, we need to unbury the thing. At the end of the last episode, I also mentioned that I had a lot of stuff on the way for both projects. Trust me, Black Friday did not help my backlog. We've got a lot lined up for both of these cars, and really we're just waiting for shipping to supply the stuff that we need to actually tackle the projects. Things are arriving, which leads me to today. I have effectively 3 things that I want to install on the car today. First thing I gotta do though is find them in the mountain of boxes that have already showed up. As cool as these suspension parts are, they're not for today. Do wish the boxes were labeled just a bit better. I'm mainly looking for 3 things that we're going to install today. The first of which is that transmission timing cap. I'm not sure if it's necessarily critical to run the car, but I don't like having a hole in the transmission. I was thinking they'd send them in a separate bag, but that didn't exactly happen. Before we go big turbo on this car, I want to make sure it's running as good as possible and not leaking anywhere. So in addition to the timing cap, today we're also going to start replacing some of the gaskets that I know are leaking on this car. The plan is to do both the valve cover and the timing chain tensioner gaskets. We're also going to upgrade some of our secondary air injection system hoses on the way. The secondary air injection system on this car is finicky. Thankfully, our buddies at 034 make a kit to upgrade the whole thing. The valve cover gasket and its hardware were shipped with my intake manifold gasket and hardware. The hardware was in the same bag and it wasn't labeled that thoroughly, so it actually took a little bit of time to sort through it. For today though, I think the best place to start is the spot that's actually limiting me from driving the car, though it is a self-imposed limit. As a temporary fix, last week I threw some tape on the hole in the transmission so nothing would fall in. Well, I don't think I really want to keep that there permanently, so it's time to put in the new cap. Like many things on this car, this is an interference fit, so it makes sense why it would just fall off through vibration. This is an OEM replacement that I just found on ECS for about $20. Now I'm not sure how long it's going to stay in there, but hopefully long enough to justify the purchase. I'm glad that fit properly. Now let's talk valve cover gasket and why I want to do this. Firstly, it is kind of necessary maintenance at this point. My TT has quite a few miles, and consequently, this gasket is done. The valve cover seems to be leaking in multiple spots, especially over by the timing chain tensioner gasket. So at this point, it's just maintenance. But secondly, it's gonna make the engine bay look a lot nicer when everything's no longer coated in grime. Replacing the valve cover gasket itself is rather easy. The only difficult part in this entire process is memorizing where all the lines you have to remove to get to it are. I've taken these off a number of times, so I have a pretty good idea of where all the vacuum lines go, but if you're doing this for the first time, you may want to pause the video at some point to see how they are routed. My general approach was to take all the lines related to the charge pipe off, then work near the N249 system, followed by the ignition coils, the brake booster, and any other lines that happen to be in the way. If you're doing this, I also suggest at the same time you order a replacement for the secondary air injection hose. From everything I've read, there's a good chance it's going to crack when you take it off. Oh, and if you have a 180 horsepower TT, you won't have to take off nearly as many vacuum lines. The general rule of thumb is to just make sure you have access to all sides of the valve cover. Once that requirement is satisfied, you're good to move on to the next step. also suggest being careful when moving your wiring. These things are known to be really brittle on these cars, so it's always good to proceed with caution. Here's that secondary air injection system hose that I mentioned earlier. I'm replacing it, so I'm taking it all the way off. Here's what the silicone upgrade looks like when compared to the OEM part. I think this OEM hose is original to the car, so it's been on there for a really long time. It's properly crusty and due for an upgrade, much like the rest of the secondary air injection system. We'll tackle the rest of that in a different episode though. Today I just want to replace this part because we're already taking it off. With the electronics and the vacuum hoses out of the way, we're good to start removing the ignition coils. These are a great aftermarket upgrade I installed a while back, so yours may look a little bit different. For the rest of the valve cover install, I suggest keeping the spark plugs in so nothing falls into the combustion chamber. That is a much bigger problem than something falling onto the spark plug. At this point, the only thing keeping the valve cover on the car are 9 10mm bolts. They're in rows of 3 on the front, the back, and the middle of the valve cover. And once they're off, you can take a screwdriver or a pry bar to pry the valve cover up. I'm choosing to replace these bolts, but it's still a good idea to be careful when you remove the back ones so you don't lose them into the abyss. And if you've never been this deep into your engine before, here's what it looks like. This car has quite a bit of mileage, so I'm expecting it to be somewhat colorful. The main things you want to look out for that could clue you into a bigger issue are metal flakes in the oil or milky oil, both of which would probably be not a very fun sight to see. Clumps of oil near the gasket are exactly the issue we're trying to fix today, so we're not worried about that whatsoever. With your valve cover off, it's also a really good time to deep clean it as much as you really want. Right when you take it off, I suggest coating it in degreaser or brake cleaner or something to basically get all the grime off, and you're going to scrub it later. At this point, I'm going to clean it by hand, just enough to get it to look better than it was. Down the line, we may powder coat it, but I haven't quite decided what color I think would fit this engine bay. I do kind of like the silver and red vibe it has going on. The next thing I did was remove the old gasket, and boy, was it in horrible condition. Generally, this is supposed to look like a ring and not like a line. There were multiple places on this gasket that were pretty much torn all the way through, and one that was literally just in 2 pieces. So in other words, pretty good idea to upgrade this now. Throughout this process, I suggest taking a microfiber cloth or whatever cloth you prefer to clean the surface that we're going to install the new gasket to. We're not to the installation step yet, but we want to make sure that the surface we're putting it on is as clean as it can possibly be. What I suggest tackling first is the cam chain tensioner gasket. These 2 rods up top are your intake and exhaust cams, and this chain is your cam chain. The gasket we're replacing is actually under this. It's currently tensioned, so we need to use this special tool that comes with the gasket kit to detension the chain. It threads into a hole in the block here and presses down on the timing chain tensioner. Anytime you're threading anything into your engine block, you need to be sure that it's threaded properly and not cross-threaded. Cross-threading anything in your block is not a cheap fix. But once it's in, I tightened it until it stopped so I had enough room to wiggle the chain around. Then I removed 4 different Torx bolts keeping the timing chain tensioner in place, 3 of which are on the outside of the block and 1 of which is right next to the tool we just installed. Once all 4 of these are removed, you should be able to unseat the timing chain tensioner and it'll be able to wiggle around a little bit. With this timing chain tensioner movable, we can now reach underneath it to take out the actual gasket. There's a metal gasket which you can slide out with a screwdriver or a pick, and below that there's actually a half-moon rubber gasket. For me, this was the part that was really compromised and leaking the most amount of oil. This one's just a little bit harder to reach if you have larger hands, so I used a really small Allen key to push it out of place. Here's what it looks like next to the new one, and you can see how crushed and compromised it is. Liquids of any kind are rather difficult to keep sealed. Any sort of a deformation on a gasket is likely to result in some form of leakage. I cleaned the surface thoroughly, and then I went to reinstall the new half-moon gasket. This part was way easier than I thought it would be. I simply put a screwdriver on the other side so I couldn't push it through, and then shoved it close enough to actually fall into place. There's two lips on the gasket which fall perfectly into two receded parts on the engine itself. Once it's sitting flush, you can throw the metal piece in place. This one is also pretty easy to get into place because you can use those bolts we removed earlier to put it in the right orientation. We have to get all these bolts torqued down to 10 Newton meters. The big thing to take note of when tightening these is you want it to be tightened down evenly. If you tighten one completely and then move on to the next one, it's not going to be seated with even pressure. So you want to tighten everything at the same time, alternating which ones you go to, and as you tighten one, another one's likely going to become loose, and you want to keep doing that until everything's properly tight. Then you can check the torque spec. And when everything's torqued down, you get the okay to remove the tool that we use to compress the timing chain tensioner. Now let's move on to the valve cover gasket itself. This is honestly a much simpler gasket to install than the timing chain tensioner gasket. The only thing we have to remove is any of the surface oil or debris that was on the mating surface. Once that's removed, you're good to install the cylinder gasket. Volkswagen and Audi recommend you use a dab of RTV silicone in 6 places when you're replacing a valve cover gasket. Basically just a gasket sealer glue. All it takes is just a little dab in each one of these places and you're good to slide on the new gasket. Most high temp RTV silicone tubes will work just fine. In some places I feel like I definitely put just a little bit too much, so I went ahead and wiped it off. But once that's to your liking, you're good to press the new gasket into place. At this point, it would be just a little silly to not touch up your valve cover before putting it on again. Unless you clean it, it's still going to have the old oil leaks on it, so you're really not going to be able to tell if you did anything. Half of the way you can tell that you actually made a change is to see if it's leaking in the future, and without cleaning it, you're really not going to be able to tell. Plus, it being shiny looks so much better. Once you set the valve cover back in place on top of the new gasket, also, I suggest double checking that you actually remember to put the gasket in there. You're good to use the new hardware or reuse the old hardware to tighten everything back down. And then it's really just as simple as rebuilding the ignition, the vacuum, the brake booster, and all of the systems that were in the way. As far as tightening the valve cover goes, I also decided to crisscross and alternate which ones I was tightening down so that it had a pretty even clamping force. I'm not too sure if that's a necessary step, but it's one I wanted to take just as a personal preference. Like I mentioned earlier, rather than reinstalling the old secondary air injection hose, I'm installing the new 034 Motorsports one. It does look quite a bit better. I was very quickly running out of daylight because it's kind of the middle of winter. Our days are short and I kind of need light to do this. I can't really think of anything worse than troubleshooting any issues I caused by doing this in the dark. So I finished reassembly and decided to come back to it the next day. Once the car was scraped and uncovered, I went through everything I touched yesterday and made sure everything was fitting and connected properly. It's the next day, just went through all of the vacuum lines we touched yesterday. We touched a lot of them. It was pretty late yesterday and I had been outside all day, so my head wasn't exactly in the right place. A little cold, little delirious. It's cold again today. I think we're ready to start the car and see if we caused any additional problems or fixed what was going on. I'm hoping oil doesn't get everywhere. I think we did it right though. When I started the car, the first thing I looked at was the boost gauge to make sure that I didn't forget about any vacuum lines. We had a normal idle vacuum, meaning I thankfully didn't forget anything. I let the car warm up, and while it was doing that, I was looking around the valve cover to see if I spotted any leaks or anything concerning. Seemed like we were good to go. So once the car was warm, I took it for a drive, and I kept my eye on it every few days for the next week. After a few days of checking on it, I can say we have solved our valve cover leaking issue. The car runs great and it looks better because it's not covered in oil. In other words, this was an absolute win. Plus, we can drive it now that we have a transmission cap. This was a good week for the TT, and I'm really excited for where this car's headed with all the packages I have to unbox. Hopefully you are too. Either way, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate that you took time out of your day to watch my video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you had fun or learned something, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. It's the best way you can support me and my content. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful day.